author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition show, it's all about the Trump indictment, the politics, the power plays, and the legal ramifications. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The last bastion of free thinking and free speech awaits. With Donald Trump facing 37 charges related to classified documents, the question on everybody's lips is whether the indictment, the subsequent trial, and the possible result will impact his electoral chances. And there's no one better placed to assess all this than longtime host of this here Liberty Nation radio show, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and all-round fount of all knowledge on things political, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
So let's start with the broad strokes. What's your take on the indictment and Trump's, let's call it, performed reaction to it?
Well, to the basic question of whether it helps or hurts his presidential aspirations, it seems to me the correct answer is it doesn't hurt them. I don't think, because you're even in a position, and we've talked about this before, where the other candidates vying for the Republican presidential nomination have been forced to defend Trump against, the attacks of the Biden administration. And that's what this is. I mean, they can say this is the Department of Justice. This is the Biden administration imprisoning their political enemy and future, leading candidate to take on Joe Biden. I mean, to say a Rubicon has been crossed would be really an understatement here. But in terms of how it affects his campaign, I think the left is both joyful and equally fearful about this, because the sense that this guy's finally getting his comeuppance, progressives feel that way. The entire Democratic Party feels as well. He deserves it. He's got it coming to him, whether it's fair or not. That's the way they feel. But on the Republican side, there's, utter defiance. And you see it in the other candidates that aren't going to accept, because, look, it's crying wolf. There may be validity to one or more or all of the charges. But who's going to really believe that now, after the Russia hoax that took 3 years, after the FBI had targeted and spied on the Trump campaign and then tried to pull him down with false charges of Russia collusion and all the other things he's been accused of? The charges may be just. I'm not going to comment on those. But the appearance of it is unmistakably Stalinist, to be honest with you, to arrest your political opponent. So I think that's got to help Trump ultimately, because the people that hate him already hate him and would never vote for him. But I think there's some people in the middle that are going, hey, wait a second.
Yeah, there was a USA Today ABC poll that came out just a couple of days ago. And I'm just trying to remember this. I'm doing this from memory, so I don't have it in front of me. But I believe it was 47%, so a plurality here, said that these were political charges. 48%, also
say
another plurality,
should have been charged.
Say he should have been charged.
So people they don't know what to make of it. And
there's a cognitive dissonance across the nation with this.
Well, people don't know how to react in the sense that they can react on the basis that this is Trump. So he has it coming to him. But they can also react on the basis of, wow, no matter how bad he is arresting your political opponent in the upcoming election, something that we do in a democracy. Is that what we hear about in South America and Africa and in banana republics? So it's a matter of which outweighs which. The fact of Trump's indiscretions, shall we say, versus the fact that he's being politically persecuted, and only the electors, should I say, the electorate in 2024 can really sort this out. And you can't blame them for not knowing what to think, especially in light of all the scandal that is sort of closing in on Joe Biden, right? And the transparent fact that Trump was arrested just as the Biden bribery allegations were reaching some sort of critical mass. So, look,
Yeah,
you take
I was,
that on top
yeah.
of just arresting your political enemy and doing it when you are feeling the heat. It's double trouble for Joe Biden.
Yeah, it really didn't seem coincidental, the timing of the
Didn't
Jack Smith's
seem
announcement.
coincidental?
No, I mean,
Didn't seem
yeah,
coincidental.
it's it's almost certainly apparent that somebody was pointing squirrels. So squirrels, go look over there. Let's talk about the independent voters here, Tim. You've said that the Democrats, they hate him anyway, and they want Donald Trump punished for something. So even
they
if
can't hate him any more than they already do. It's not even possible.
And you've got the Republicans who have this memory of what in policy terms was, let's be fair, it was a very successful presidency up until the pandemic. And so you've got the Republican voters, and they're looking at Donald Trump. He did some really good conservative style policies that a lot of people liked. But they remember that was all tarnished with as you say, the Russia collusion hoax, which is what it was, perpetrated by people in government, by the instruments of government. But then you've got the independents. Now, will these independents, will they think either A, we should go for Joe Biden because then we won't have all these scandals, these drawn out legacy media hit parades, all these things. He's going to be through court his entire presidency. Or do they think that the only way to stop the slide into, as you say, a banana republic style thing, because if it can happen to one side, eventually it's going to be used on the other side, right? Do they think that the only way to stop that is to get Trump in and let him unleash his own personal whirlwind on those who have been politically persecuting him for these alleged crimes?
Well, on top of this Rubicon that's been crossed, which presents the voters with a situation they've never had to evaluate before, right? A former president and perhaps future president being arrested by a sitting president who's a political opponent. But there's also another tremendous unknown factor in all this, and that is the once-in-a-century pandemic. Because this is another variable in this, how would Trump have fared in November of 2020 if there had not been a pandemic? We'll never know the answer to that, but you've got to think, based on the fundamentals of the economy, that he would have, at the very least, come closer than he did, and perhaps he would have won. So I think the voters have to say to themselves, or they should say to themselves, let's evaluate the Trump presidency up through March of 2020, and then we can add that and then subtract whatever you want to subtract for January 6th, and then compare that to the actual track record of Joe Biden post-pandemic, when he, of course, he's the one that benefited from the vaccines that Trump developed. So there's so many unknowns, so many entirely unprecedented things. You can say we had a pandemic 100 years ago, but that was not during a presidential election. So there's so many things for people to process that I think, look, as they get closer to the election, the fact that Trump is well ahead of Biden in a few polls right now, they'll start looking at it and saying, "But wait a second, this guy's under either indictment or was convicted or is facing conviction, facing judgment. Is it really safe to vote for him? And on the other hand, they say, okay, so we could vote for Biden, but he's so enfeebled and so weak, and the economy is so stretched thin by inflation and rising prices, which are tied together, of course, that, people are presented with a real, would you call it a Hobson's choice? Because the way that Trump has been framed is that he really is like Pol Pot on steroids. And so this is what people have been bombarded with for 8 years now. Does that mean they're on overload and they're going to push back? Or does that mean that, okay, I won't vote for him? We just don't know.
And we'll be carrying on this conversation with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation senior political analyst Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were discussing the Trump indictment and how that's going to impact him running up to the 2024 election. But what I want to talk about now, Tim, is the interplay between Joe Biden and President Trump and really how the polls are looking at this and what factors we can draw in there. So I believe you've got the recent average of polls for us, haven't you, for the 2024 general election?
Yes, it shows that Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden by just under 2 points. Now, how significant that is, it's hard to tell, except you've got to think that's going to change quite a bit because we're going to be hearing so much about these 37 counts that Trump is standing against after, pleading not guilty. For all the complicated, unprecedented factors that people have to weigh, including the arrest of a former president and political enemy, and whatever transgressions they believe Trump actually committed. They also have to deal with the fact that the choice in the end actually comes down to something that can be described fairly easily. Are they going to vote for the guy who is perceived as too weak, or the guy that's too strong? In other words, Joe Biden is someone who weakness is now defining. Donald Trump is the opposite. Strength defines him, whether you see it excessive strength or whatever, but he's never been called weak.
It's that toxic masculinity of his that you're talking about, isn't it?
That's correct. You picked that up. Good for you, Mark. But this is the choice, basically, between two candidates that a majority of Americans say they don't want running for president. They don't like this choice, which means the turnout might not be that great. But with ballot harvesting, you'd think in a small turnout that Democrats definitely have an advantage because they can generate ballots for their candidate to a degree that the Republicans can't. And that's a complicated question because of community organizing essentially gives the Democrats a huge advantage in harvesting ballots in the many states where that is legal. So I think people have to make a really hard choice. I mean, this is not Al Gore against George W. Bush. This is not Bill Clinton against Robert Dole. And this is not Ronald Reagan against Walter Mondale. You're talking about two polar opposite forces who would certainly put a beating on their opponents once the election was over. So if I'm the Democrats, I guess I'd be gleeful that Trump finally got his comeuppance, quote unquote, but I'd also fear for the country. And I'd really fear for what happens if Trump gets elected again, because I can't even imagine the measures he's going to take. And maybe then all those leftists who promised to leave the country when George Bush was elected, when Donald Trump was elected, maybe they'll actually leave the country for fear of what a President Trump back in the White House might do.
Well, we're discussing obviously that former President Trump is likely going to be the front runner, and as you mentioned to me before, Tim, the vagaries this far out, you can't really get a good sense of how the Republican nomination is going to go. Although we can presume that the indictment will, to some extent, impact that. But let's talk about the Democrat field, because you said one of the most interesting quip lines when we were speaking earlier about a plug and play president. Would you care to expand on that? I just thought it was fascinating, and these words perfectly apply. They just click in the mind.
Well, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is traveling the country and appearing on media, even on Fox News with Sean Hannity, as if he's a presidential candidate, while at the same time saying, I fully support Joe Biden. He's done a great job. I love the legislation he's passed, et cetera, et cetera. But he's putting himself in a position with that interview, with ads that he's taking out, attacking Ron DeSantis. And people might say, well, he's doing that because the Democrats are more scared of DeSantis than they are of Trump as an electoral opponent. But he is acting in every way as if he was a presidential candidate without being one. So plug and play means if Joe Biden does, and it certainly is conceivable with 17 months to go before the election of an enfeebled president looking for a second term, that he just might not make it to the starting gate. Well, Gavin Newsom is ready to jump right in like a plug and play device that you get for your computer. Just plug it in and it works. And of course, Newsom is a incredibly glib, handsome, articulate, clever politician. Everything that Joe Biden isn't. And by exposing himself as much as he has, attacking DeSantis, going on national TV, crisscrossing the country to make speeches, presumably in support of Joe Biden's candidacy, he's signaling to the base, look at the contrast here between this old man who can't even leave the stage without face planting and me, young, virile, handsome, dynamic. The comparison is, the contrast is unmistakable, and he's making himself very much available to a base that really doesn't want to see Joe Biden run again, even though they're grateful for the fact that he took down Donald Trump in 2020.
A candidate in waiting would smell as sweet. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
It's always too much fun, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
What legal troubles does former President Donald Trump find himself in, and how will these play out over the next year or 2 years? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. We are joined today by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and fount of all things knowledgeable when it comes to the law, Mr. Scott D. Casenta. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
Scott, this week you're going to earn your money. It's all about Donald Trump and the indictment. So give me your basic, as a lawyer, give me your basic overview on what you think the situation is.
So if we're going to set aside the political nature of the prosecution,
we'll get to the political,
which is
a
big thing to set aside, to be sure. Yep. If it were not a political prosecution, it would just read like, gee, this guy's got a real uphill battle in front of him, this defendant, to defeat these charges. Basically, they've got 30 plus documents that they say Donald Trump shouldn't have access to, and they're charging him with a federal crime for having each one of them, and then multiple federal crimes for how he tried to hide that he had them and keep them from investigators. And if he just gets convicted on, one of those, that is maybe a life sentence effectively for Donald Trump. He just turned 77, and so any significant custodial sentence might be a life sentence. And the evidence in at least one of those cases seems to be quite strong based on the transcript of a recorded interview that took place in Donald Trump's office in New Jersey while he was passing around allegedly passing around documents he didn't have legal access to.
So obviously there's a lot of talk about how this is the thing that's going to stop Donald Trump. Finally, they say in the very, very left-leaning news outlets, which is the majority of them, I guess, nowadays in America. But even if he is found guilty down the road, and we will talk about the timescale in just a moment, there's nothing to stop him still campaigning and still assuming the office of the presidency, is there?
Absolutely not. Famously, Democrat Lyndon LaRouche ran for president a number of times, and one of those from federal prison where he was for mail fraud. And he actually got 5% of the vote against Bill Clinton in the 1996 primaries. So it's been done. And the Democrats led the way on that one, and no barrier for Donald Trump to do likewise.
Yeah, I believe constitution. I think there's only 3 prerequisites for being the president. It's over a certain age, to be naturalized, to be born in the United States. And what's the third one?
Well, the third one is a term of residency in the United States. So you can't be sort of born here and then be raised somewhere else and then run for a president from that foreign country. You have to. Yeah,
14 years, I think, isn't it? 14 years, something like that.
Yeah.
So he could still run. He could still win, assuming that this. Assuming 2 things, I guess, right? One, that he wins the nomination, and 2, that he wins.
Yeah, we're talking about the primary and then the general, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about the time scale on these things. So it's pretty much a rule, an unwritten rule, that the Justice Department won't deal with any prosecutions in the period just prior to an election, which I think is like 3 months, right?
I believe that is their policy. Yeah. But in this case, if I can jump the line here, we have a different situation altogether, which is that the judge sets the calendar for these things. And Judge Cannon, in this case, who is a Trump appointee and has made favorable rulings for Donald Trump in the past, on the Mar-a-Lago case, when he sued the Department of Justice for the raid at Mar-a-Lago, she was the judge appointed in that case, and she made some sort of pro-Trump rulings that basically people think that, it's a great judge for him, and she will set the calendar in this case. And if it's approaching the election, in other words, even if DOJ policy is 3 months, Mark, if it's 3 months and 3 weeks or 4 months, even still, I think we can expect this judge, and in fact, probably most federal judges who aren't sort of never Trumpers or having Trump derangement syndrome, would also delay the trial. We've got a contest for the leader of the United States of America. The incumbent is the one who's prosecuting the case against the challenger, and it's his court case. The implications are staggering. And I think it would be wise, any federal judge, if Donald Trump actually won the nomination, okay, and it was him versus Biden, well, it would be really smart for the judge to say that let's hold off, because in many ways, I think that election for a lot of people will be a referendum on that case, and there's no legal reason to have it done ahead of time. It's not like we can say, well, there's a compelling issue here. This has to be resolved before November if we're in, beginning of June, for instance. Okay,
sure.
There's no reason not to wait some more time. The evidence is not going to spoil.
Okay, so now bear with me on this as I track down this particular rabbit hole. If if Donald Trump does indeed become the nominee for the Republican Party, and then Joe Biden becomes the Democrat nominee, which presumably he will be, barring some health incident or something, then the court case could be put on hold, and if not by the Judge Eileen Cannon, then certainly by the Department of Justice, just out of because it would look really bad for the Department of Justice. Then, if Donald Trump won, he could pardon himself and then stop the entire investigation, right?
Well, so those are two separate things, and he would, I'm sure, do both. So the stopping the prosecution would be something he would certainly do, and that's just a matter of the prosecutor saying to the judge, we want to withdraw these charges. There was famously a case in federal court in the D.C. area where the Trump administration said that they wanted to drop the prosecution. I think it was of General Flynn, perhaps, and the judge sort of made the prosecution jump through a bunch of hoops before they were able to drop it. And that judge, Emmett Sullivan, I think his name was, Judge Sullivan said, you brought these charges, you have to come and explain to me why you want to withdraw them. It was sort of his power play against the Trump administration. But even still, even in the face of a Trump deranged judge, they had to drop the charges. Now, the pardon, I imagine Donald Trump will have it written out and in his pocket to sign it the second he takes the oath of office, because it's almost like a magic wand in the sense of the second he signs that document, if he were removed from office the following day, a future president could not, or excuse me, any future Justice Department or president could not file federal charges against him for those acts that took place. There's another sort of side angle for this, Mark. I was thinking about maybe exploring it in the written form on libertynation.com, but I think we may see a case where all presidents now pardon themselves for any federal crime on their last day in office, so that they don't have to suffer through these things. Donald Trump has said in his post arraignment public statement that he's going to institute a special prosecutor against Joe Biden. If you were a Joe Biden advisor, the smart thing to say to him is sign yourself a pardon right now, so you don't have to worry about this.
It is indeed the power of kings. And we'll be back with Scott DeCosenza after this short break, discussing the descent into a banana republic. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back talking liberty with Scott DeCosenza. Earlier in the show, we discussed Trump's legal travails and what that means for him as both a candidate and a potential future president. But now I'd like to discuss the ins and outs of what this trial, should it come to trial, actually look like. Now, Scott, I believe because this is being held at the Miami Federal Courthouse, that the jury pool has to be drawn from Southern Florida. So that's Miami-Dade, Broward, places like that, right?
Yeah, so the federal judicial system divides into districts, and where those are geographically depends on where charges should be filed. There was some discussion about whether charges would be filed against Trump in D.C. or in Florida, but they have been filed in Florida, and that's where the jury pool will come from. I think there's like 6 or 7 counties Miami and south and a little bit north of there, where all the people will be.
Well, let's jump on that very, very quickly, Scott. You say there was talk about it possibly being held in Washington, D.C., the trial being held in Washington, D.C. And I can kind of see the argument for why that would be, for both the honest reasons and the dishonest reasons. The honest reasons being, well, the White House, and presumably where Donald Trump got the documents in the first place, is in Washington, D.C. The dishonest reason being that the prosecutors might be hoping for a jury that is essentially a Washington, D.C. jury, rabidly anti-Trump, and willing to convict him regardless of what is exposed in the court.
First the verdict,
so what?
Then the trial for those jurors, right?
Yeah, then the trial. Yeah, verdict, then the trial. So why would this be filed in Florida, of all places?
Well, the policy of the Department of Justice, as it should be, is to file charges where crimes occur. So if somebody's murdered in Wisconsin, then the charges are going to be filed in Wisconsin. And Donald Trump allegedly committed most of these crimes at Mar-a-Lago and in Palm Beach. And so it's appropriate to lodge those charges in Florida, which he caught a lucky break. I mean, just the assignment of this judge alone, that's a break. And that, the jurors will be less likely to be never Trumpers or suffer from Trump derangement syndrome and give him a fair shake. Now, I will say this, Mark, before you put a pin in your question there, just I want to get it on the record. I don't think we're going to see a trial in this case before the election. Better legal minds than I, namely Jonathan Turley, have suggested that Trump's best option is to delay. And given the possibility of interlocutory appeals, I think we will see significant delays in the case. And what that means is most cases have issues for appeal, and those appeals are heard after the conclusion of the case. So you get a conviction, the defense thinks it's unfair, thinks that certain rules were violated, and they may be entitled either to a reversal or a new trial. They appeal, they go to the appellate court, and so on and so forth. Maybe it gets past that to the Supreme Court, and who knows what. But there's another type of appeal, which is much more rare, which is the interlocutory appeal, which is you say to the judge in the current case, hey, this issue that you've ruled on, I don't think you've ruled correctly, or it's a novel issue. Let's take it to the appeals court and wait a while on this proceeding until we hear from them. And then it's up to the appeals court to say whether they will take it or not, or grant a stay in the lower court proceedings. Because of the stakes and the nature of the prosecution, I expect we're going to see some opportunity for the defense to delay the proceedings with that type of legal maneuver. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there. I think the smart money bet is if they're motivated to stretch it as long as they can, they will be able to get it so that any trial will be past the election.
So let's make an assumption that Donald Trump doesn't win that first he's the nominee and secondly he doesn't win. At some point it will go to trial though, right? Unless
he pleads, which I imagine so if I was advising Mr. Trump, my advice would be run for president and win, and then pardon yourself and cancel the prosecution. If you can't do that, making a deal for no prison time seems like it would be his best move, given if the quality of the evidence is as the indictment suggests, and it may not be. It's certainly within the possibility of the Justice Department to play fast and loose, although it has the ring of authenticity, I will say. When I read the indictment, it doesn't look like flim-flam. It looks like they have the goods. Okay, so let's talk about what, obviously we don't know what could or would or wouldn't or shouldn't happen with an actual trial, but we do know that so the two lines of defense that are most likely, not including run for president, win, pardon yourself, although that is a fantastic defense, and it's certainly one I'm going to use if I'm ever facing legal trouble. They don't teach it in law school, Mark, because so few defendants have that as a practical option, but maybe they'll add it now. You never know. So one is to delay for this purpose. Number two is to get a jury that has at least some sympathy with Donald Trump. Now, we talked that this is in South Florida, so Broward County, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade being the most populous county in Florida. And so the jury will be selected, the jury and the provisionals, are they called? The extras? Right. They'll all be pulled from this area. And now, if we look at Miami-Dade, for example, in 2016, Miami-Dade went for Hillary Clinton by 30 points. This was a very anti-Trump area. And then in 2020, Joe Biden won Miami-Dade. That's true. But the gap was just down to 6 points in the difference there. And then in 2022, you had this Republican surge brought on, I guess, by Ron DeSantis' performance in Florida in the 4 years he was governor originally. And for his second term, he took essentially what was like a 20-point turnaround from his 2008 to 2020, which suggests to me that Miami-Dade isn't quite the seething blue bastion that it once was. Now, it's still fairly heavily Democrat, I believe, but Donald Trump has more chance of getting at least one
sympathetic juror now than he would have done, let's say, in 2016, doesn't he?
So one of the things you said, I would just take a small issue with,
Sure.
which was that you said in 2016 that the voters were anti-Trump because of the polling results. And I would just take a quibble with that and say that I think, as I look at them, they're just more pro-Democrat during that election cycle, rather than exhibiting a particular anti-Trump sentiment, which I think is important for our discussion here.
I would agree. Yeah.
I don't see an anti-Trump vibe or, general consensus or mood coming from that area. And he does have a better chance now because of there's seemingly less, knee-jerk affiliation or sort of tribal team. We're on team this and team that. So look, if you're going to get any district or any place in the United States where you'd want to have this case tried, South Florida would not be, at the bottom of the list. I don't know that it would be at the very top.
Well, what about North Florida, South Alabama?
Well, North Florida actually might be better. I haven't looked at those tabs, but I would guess they might have some different population than the South Florida.
And I am right.
Democrat versus Republican.
I am right in thinking here, Arnie, that being a federal criminal trial, that it's a unanimous verdict. So that would be all 12 people have to agree.
Sadly, Mark, some states allow non-unanimous verdicts in criminal trials, which I think is anathema to the system that was created to ensure that people can't be put in a cage unless their fellow citizens agree. But thankfully, it's one of the protections we still have in the federal system of the unanimous jury verdict. That's right. One person who believes that Donald Trump should not be convicted can vote no, and it is appropriate. I will add this point. It's legal now. Judges can restrict this in their own courtrooms, but it is perfectly legal for an attorney to ask a jury to vote not guilty, not because of the facts in evidence, but because the law or the prosecution itself is unjust. This is permissible, very rarely done, but it's done sort of covertly and sort of in at an oblique angle in some drug cases. You'll see this, some like, are we really going to send this person? Well, this can be also attacked directly, and I would suspect that might be something that the Trump might want to go for, especially if the facts, as revealed in court, show that this is good evidence of his, violation of this law.
Well, we'll see how it all plays out. And Scott DeCosenza will be covering pretty much all of this on the pages of libertynation.com. Scott, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's almost all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'd like to thank our guests on today's show, longtime host of LN Radio and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, and LN's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. And of course, I want to extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in. Now, a final thought to leave you with this week. There's a fantastic quote by Francis Bacon that goes, quote, "If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties." End quote. Now, perhaps sometimes we're all a little too certain in our beliefs. And there are some who are often far too certain for their own good and for the good of others. They don't believe in free thinking, let alone free speech. They demand that your view is an echo of their own, lest you be deemed a fundamental threat to their own fundamentalist ideology. It is only through clear and free thinking that we ultimately prevail upon the truth. And perhaps that's why some are so opposed to it. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.